to the family and friends of that victim. And that is precisely why we have decided to take action to try and create a higher degree of confidence for victims and their families when it comes to the administration of sentences.
Out with the police on a regular visit with Gwent Police on Friday. A large amount of their casework was dealt with serious, high-risk offenders being released halfway through their sentence. This is having a massive drain on their resources locally and nationally. Will the Minister commit to review this automatic release?
Well, I'm sure the honourable gentleman will join me and support actively the proposals I made to change the automatic release to 2/3 for serious violent and sexual offenders. That will indeed help, I think, local police forces like Gwent in terms of management of offenders in the community. But I just want to pay tribute to the work the police do in that respect.
Sir David Davis.
When violent criminals are released, there's a time of fear and sometimes terror for their erstwhile victims. Release under licence allows restriction of movement and restriction of access, but not beyond licence. When he is reconsidering the issue of licence, can he also consider whether restrictions can be put upon those criminals after their licence period is over in order to protect the victims that they...
Well, my right honourable friend asks a very important question. I have to accept the limitations of the period of sentencing, and while supervision is an important part of the licence period, what happens beyond that is difficult in terms of court order, but work can be and should be done by the probation service to make sure that we are protected as fully as possible.
Oh, very well. Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Almost 2 years ago to the day, this government made a pledge to increase the maximum sentence for causing death by dangerous driving from 14 years to life. In the light of the Minister's recent announcement, will he be revising this pledge? Because to date, no action has been taken.
No, I'm grateful to the honourable lady who I know has written to me as well, and of course I repeat my pledge to get on with legislating on that issue as soon as possible. We have hopefully a new session coming. I'm not going to prejudge what might be said then, but during that session I think there will be an opportunity for us to right this wrong.
And finally, there won't be time for supplementaries, but we'll take Mr. Andrew Griffiths.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Question 15.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government is prioritising support for victims through the criminal justice system and beyond, and is committed to tackling poor criminal justice outcomes for them. And just last month, my right honourable friend, the Lord Chancellor, and myself took part in a round table at Downing Street to discuss support for victims of rape. And victims and stakeholders highlighted the importance of support in their engagement with the criminal justice system.
The Minister will be aware that the recent consultation on the Code of Practice for Victims of Crime has recently closed, and she will be considering representations. Will she look closely at the greater use of criminal compensation orders for the victims of child sexual abuse, which are used in a woefully small number of cases, meaning that these vulnerable people have to relive the trauma either through a private prosecution or through the Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme?
Minister.
Thank you. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for his question. Compensation orders are an important power. The purpose of the order is to pay the victim compensation for any personal injury, loss or damage caused by an offence, and they allow courts to ensure that offenders make financial reparations to victims where this is possible. As part of our review of the Victims Code, we will be considering the recommendation on raising awareness of criminal compensation orders made by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse.
The honourable member for Ashfield is leaving the House voluntarily at the next election, which is a very considerable detriment to Ashfield and to the House. So it would be discourteous of me not to hear her. So I will hear her. Gloria De Piero.
Mr. Speaker, support for victims isn't good enough, so can I appeal to the Government to change the law to remove the automatic entitlement of joint assets from those who have attempted to murder their partners? The case I am working on sees the perpetrator demand £90,000 from the woman he attempted to kill, or as she puts it, a £3,000 reward for every stab wound.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable lady for her question, and perhaps I can suggest that we meet after this session, and she can perhaps outline a little bit more to her about her case. Thank you.
Other questions? Bill Wiggin.
Question 1 with reference to 24, Mr. Speaker.
I know what he means. Mr. Speaker, I laid a written ministerial statement last week and at the Conservative Party conference announced reforms that will end automatic halfway release for the most serious violent and sexual offenders. These criminals will be required to serve 2/3 of their sentence behind bars, and I also announced that we will allow courts across England and Wales to sentence offenders guilty of alcohol-related offences for up to 120 days of electronically monitored abstinence. That follows 2 successful pilots, including one in London, launched by the then London Mayor, now the Prime Minister.
Go again.
Mr. Speaker, during the last prorogation of Parliament, I was looking forward to serving on a jury. When the Supreme Court decided we should be here, I had to be released from that jury service by a distinguished judge in Hereford. It cannot be right that the judges decide when we sit and who attends, but his department have been pathetic in their written responses to me about how they propose to make sure that we can fulfil both sorts of public service.
Well, I'm distressed to hear that from my honourable friend. Can I say that I've sat as a judge at Hereford, and it's a most pleasant court. Matters of jury service and jury duty are, of course, a matter for the court system. And I have to tell him that it would be, I think, inappropriate for my department or ministers to intervene. No, I'm sorry, it's not appropriate for us to intervene in these matters. This Parliament changed the rules about jury service some years ago, not to exempt members of Parliament or indeed judges or barristers. I think that was the right thing to do. And whilst the system is there to accommodate him and his particular needs, like all other members of the public, we just have to work with respect to the system.
Bergen.
Speaker, the coming Labour government is committed to restoring all legal aid funded early legal help. That will restore legal aid help in nearly 500,000 cases, but the government refuses to do it. So which of these groups of people does the Secretary of State think would be undeserving of such legal help? The 50,000 or so people who get help fighting dodgy landlords and other housing issues? The 90,000 or so people who get help fighting cruel decisions denying them the social security they're entitled to? Or the thousands of people who get help taking on bullying bosses? Which is it? Or will they change their mind and agree to back this policy?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I'm afraid I'll take no lectures from a Labour Party that took a knife to civil legal aid back in the 1990s. I have a very long memory about legal aid, and I challenge anybody else to better it. I take his point about early intervention, and that's why we are working to, indeed, with a £5 million pilot. I won't be heckled by the Right Honourable Lady in that way. I won't. I think it's extremely discourteous, Mr. Speaker, and I'm trying to... And now she wants to insult me even further.
Order. No. The Secretary of State for Justice is entitled to be heard. There is quite a lot of noisy chuntering from a secretary position, but I wish to hear the mellifluous tones of the Right Honourable Gentleman, who is now looking discontented, to put it mildly. Blurt it out, man, with your usual elegance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I will say is that we are working on a housing repossession pilot. We are investing £5 million in early intervention services. I take a great interest in the work of law centres, and I want to do more to help them.
Thank you. Jack Lepresti.
Can I ask my honourable friend what plans his department has to help facilitate careers for people who want to join the Ministry of Justice, who've served in the military or the armed forces, in their to help communicate and facilitate their transition back into civilian life?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very important point about the role of the armed forces. Indeed, they have a huge offer to make, and I will talk to him further about the points that he made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent FOI of mental health trusts showed that they had spent millions of pounds on legal representation at inquests. In the same year, 2017-18, just £118,000 was available to families for legal aid. Does the government agree that such inequality of representation means justice is extremely hard to achieve?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I fully understand where the honourable gentleman is coming from. It is fundamental to our legal and justice system that everyone has a right to a fair trial. Nonetheless, I do feel that it's important that we give our utmost support for bereaved families. I'm determined to do all that I can to ensure that bereaved families are at the heart of the coronial process, and we are working across government to achieve this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To reduce reoffending, we need to increase their employment prospects. what incentives can the Minister offer towards employers to take on people who've recently left prison?
Well, I know that the honourable member has done some work in this area as a former trustee of a offending charity. Absolutely, this is very important. We recently set up the New Futures Network. We have 500 employers signed up to try and ensure that ex-offenders get rehabilitated into jobs in the community.
Mr. Speaker, the number of civil legal aid providers has fallen by a third since 2013. In February, the government announced under the legal support plan a review of criminal legal aid providers. Will the government today announce a similar review of civil legal aid provision to look at the levels of remuneration and how we can make sure there is capacity in all areas of the country?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as the honourable member will know, that criminal defence lawyers play a crucial role in upholding the rule of law and the government, and we greatly value the work that they do. We currently have the Legal Aid Support Action Plan, which we are working through, and I'm keen to do all that I can as a Minister with legal aid in my portfolio in this regard.
Might I reasonably hope that the Chair of the Justice Select Committee can ask a single-sentence question? Mr. Robert Neal.
Will the Lord Chancellor confirm that the Government has no plans to change the right to trial by jury in serious criminal cases?
I'm happy to confirm that, Mr. Speaker.
Excellent. Karen Lee.
Mr. Speaker, people in Lincoln are waiting on average 59 weeks for their PIP appeal to be heard. It's gone up by 10 weeks in the last 7 months. The Government have created a hostile environment for disabled people where their mandatory reconsideration process causes stress, illness and hardship. Will the Secretary of State take urgent action to reduce the PIP appeal waiting time and provide accessible and financial support mechanisms for those going through the process?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that point. I think the level of appeals and the number of successful appeals remains stubbornly high, and that's been a matter of concern to all of us who have taken interest in this for many years. I want to see the mandatory reassessment process be as meaningful as possible so that we don't end up in this situation where, in effect, the courts are having to overturn these decisions. So I take on board very much her point, and I'm looking at it anxiously.
Sir Peter Bottomley.
I'm aware of 2 cases in the last year where the most senior appeal court judges have come to a unanimous agreement, later to be followed by unanimous disagreement by the Supreme Court. Would it be a good idea, the ministers may be aware of more, that there could be an independent body who could write an explanation so those of us who are not lawyers can understand what is actually going on?
Well, a novel point, Mr. Speaker. I think the judgments of their lordships and the Lords Justice and the Court of Appeal speak for themselves, and they are increasingly written in clearer language. And I think the recent Supreme Court judgment was an eloquent example of that, whatever one's view of it might be.
Morris.
There's growing concern about the explosion in violence in our prisons directed against prison officers. Does the Minister understand or even agree with the assessment of the Prison Officers Association that the Government is breaching its responsibilities under health and safety legislation by wilfully exposing hard-pressed prison staff to assaults currently running at 10,000 a year, over 28 a day on average?
We're very concerned about the level of violence in prisons. I'm very pleased that the 10 Prisons Project showed that we can reduce violence in prisons by reducing drugs in prison. I'm very pleased that the Government recently announced the £100 million investment in prison security to make our prisons safer for those who work in them.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for recently discussing the important Camp Hill site on the island with me. Will the Ministry of Justice now develop, with me and the Isle of Wight Council, a considered position in a timely way so that we can get a public interest outcome?
I was very pleased to speak to my honourable friend about this matter, and as he knows, I've offered to meet with him and any others, and very pleased to do that.
Gill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is the Government taking to ensure that ordinary people are not priced out of accessing proper legal advice and representation by the civil legal aid means test?
Wendy? No, Wendy.
Access to legal aid is an important part of our justice system, and in the last year, £1.6 billion was paid in legal advice. This government remains committed to giving people access to legal aid when they need it.
Yes. Very brief questions now, as we're short of time. Tom Tugendhat.
Very briefly, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor will remember there used to be a convention of judges not speaking publicly other than in their written declarations. Would the Lord Chancellor agree with me that speaking publicly can sometimes confuse people of what is the judgment of the court and what is personal opinion?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The judgments speak for themselves, and the judges can't really answer back when it comes to criticism. So that's why I'm here to defend them.
Chief Stevens.
I refer the House to my entry in the Members' Register. Further to the Honourable Member for Hammersmith's question, the Association of British Insurers are very clear that the small claims limit in employer and public liability cases should remain at £1,000. We know the government wouldn't listen to victims of injury. They wouldn't listen to the Justice Select Committee. So why aren't they listening to the industry body who speak for all insurers across the UK?
Well, the £1,000 limit the Honourable Lady refers to in her question hasn't been changed for very many years. It is, of course, a great deal lower than the general limit for small claims processes, which is £10,000. And by having a small claims track limit at £5,000, in my view, it balances access to justice considerations with reasonably administering the court system.
More than 7 out of 10 men and women in prison have at least 2 mental health conditions, and last year we saw a 30% increase in self-inflicted deaths. So what investigation has the government undertaken to look at the relationship between this increase in deaths and the significant delays that there are in transferring prisoners to hospital during these
Yes, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. She raises a hugely important point. Can I assure her the mental health of offenders and prisoners is my priority. I think we can do far more and far more sensibly working with other departments, particularly the Department of Health, to get those services, the Commission services, right and to stop those delays. So I will talk with her further about this important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited Newhall Women's Prison, which borders my constituency. We discussed the issue of drug smuggling and how much of this could be prevented if they had a body scanner. I know that 10 were installed in male prisons in January this year, but there have been no further announcements on rolling this out to other prisons or indeed any women's prisons like Newhall. Could the Minister therefore give the House an update on the plans for future rollouts of this vitally important equipment?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I know she'll welcome the £170 million that we're investing both up to now and in the next year on new scanners. I'll look at her issue very carefully. We are prioritising Category B local prisons, which are particularly problematic in terms of security, but I will take away the point about Newhall and consider it carefully.
The Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale has been jumping up and down like Zebedee, so I think he'll be inconsolable if he's not heard. Let's hear the fella. Tim Farron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Local families and police in the South Lakes have been badly affected by the closure of Kendall Court. Will the Secretary of State agree to meet with me to ensure that we restore access to justice in the South Lakes?
Minister Phil.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question and the enthusiasm with which he caught the Speaker's attention. I would, of course, be delighted to meet with him to discuss any access to justice concerns he may have relating to his constituency.
In the tragic case of the baby which died in prison and the mother who laboured on her own in a prison cell, would the Minister please, in her review, look at 2 things? Number 1, were there enough prison officers on duty that night? And number 2, will every single pregnant prisoner please be given a healthcare plan suitable to her needs in her pregnancy for every day of that pregnancy in which she's in prison?
The Honourable Member makes a really important point. I'd like to assure her that there are a number of investigations taking place. There are 10 separate investigations taking place in relation to this incident at the moment, and I'm very pleased to announce that the the Secretary of State and I have formally asked the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman to conduct an overarching investigation into this incident. I spoke to the Governor of the prison yesterday, and she has introduced hourly checks throughout the night for all pregnant women, and fortnightly pregnancy review boards are being held for all pregnant women, involving a multidisciplinary team. That's happening throughout the female prisoner estate.
It's from Strangford, Jim Shannon.
Will the Minister further outline what recent work has been carried out in cooperation with the Department of Education targeting young people and knife crime?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He'll know that there is cross-governmental work on this. We have a strategy on that issue, and indeed the teachable moment and the importance of education is something that we absolutely understand.
Tony Orangeliazzi.
Mr Speaker, what assessment has the Prisons Minister made of the discrepancy in starting salary and pay scales of a prison officer employed by Park Prison in Bridgend, which is run by G4S, and a government-run HMPs in Swansea and Cardiff?
Yeah, we have increased prison officers' salaries in the public sector by over 2% across the board. The public and private systems are separate and both produce excellent outcomes in some circumstances for prisoners.
Melanie On.
Mr Speaker, in June, a 15-year-old broke into my house to steal my car and did so with an older accomplice. And thankfully, Humberside Police were excellent in finding those two and making sure that they were imprisoned and put on remand. That 15-year-old, however, has been released on tag. Apparently has removed the tag and has stolen 2 further vehicles. So, and those vehicles have been crashed into community buildings and people's homes as well. So can the ministers please explain to my community how the current system is working to protect them?
Yeah. Well, I listened to the honourable lady's case with care and concern. I think that merits a further conversation about that particular case, and I'll have that with her.
Order. Urgent question. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could I ask the Foreign Minister to make a statement on US troop withdrawal from North Syria?
The Minister of State, Dr Andrew Mewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his urgent question. We are consulting with the US on the response to proposed Turkish military action in north-east Syria. The Foreign and Defence Secretaries both spoke to their US counterparts yesterday. The US position, including any movement of US troops, is of course a matter for the US government. However, the US Department of Defence said in a statement yesterday that the US does not endorse a Turkish operation in north-east Syria. We have been consistently clear with Turkey that unilateral military action must be avoided, as it would destabilise the region and threaten efforts to secure the lasting defeat of Daesh. As members of the global coalition, our focus remains on securing the enduring defeat of Daesh. We will continue to work with the US and other international partners to that end.
Tobias Elwood.
Well, I'm grateful to the Foreign Minister. I firstly declare an interest. I am a dual US national. Mr Speaker, the US is our most trusted and valued ally. We share the same vision and indeed help wanting to shape the world around us, defend its international standards and values. It's why we stepped forward in the first place to form the international coalition to defeat Daesh that the Minister just made reference to. That bond, that friendship, that trust means that we have a privileged relationship with the US that enables us to be honest and speak out if there are differences of opinion. And today is one such case. The President's decision to remove US troops from northern Syria goes against official and congressional advice and will leave the Syrian Democratic Forces exposed to the expected Turkish offensive to establish a 30-kilometre safe zone in northern Syria. These are the same Kurdish forces who worked with us to defeat Daesh. Essentially, they were our boots on the ground. And now it seems we're turning our backs on them. If this goes ahead, it will be no orderly handover. The Kurds will fight to defend their land. And if this zone is secured, Turkey then intends to move over 3 million refugees that are currently in Turkey into this zone, fundamentally altering the ethnic makeup of the region. Mr. Speaker, if anything is to be learnt from previous interventions, you don't abandon the very people you step forward to help before the job is done. General Petraeus said it's no longer good enough to defeat the enemy, you have to enable the local. We need to learn from Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan, Charlie Wilson's war, and after 9/11, as well as Libya. You create a vacuum, it's quickly filled by stakeholders who pursue a very different agenda. So could I ask the Minister, further to his conversations, or the Secretary of State's conversations, will the Prime Minister be speaking to the President on this matter? And have he spoken, or indeed the Foreign Secretary spoken, to our coalition allies on this fundamental change in US foreign policy? He says US troops is a matter of placement of US troops is matter for that country, but they are part of an international coalition. We will only defeat the challenges around the world if we work and stick together. So can I ask also, Mr. Speaker, what impact will this decision have on our efforts, our DFID efforts, to help provide aid to this country, this war-torn country? And he talks about preventing Turkey or discouraging Turkey from crossing the border in some form of invasion, creating that safe zone. What actions does he think the international community, or indeed Britain, will take if such an action does in fact take place? And more generally, Mr. Speaker, does he acknowledge that the character of conflict has changed? These are not soldiers in uniform, but radicalised extremists that are committed to pursuing their jihadist agenda. Many of these fighters come from across Europe, including the UK. Simply denying dual nationals the ability to return to the UK is not enough to keep our nation safe. So does he agree that the international community must design a better long-term legal solution to the challenge which will not go away? Neither the SDF nor Turkey has the desire to properly process the number of detainees and foreign fighters. If Turkey invades, the SDF will fight back, and these camps, such as in Al-Hol, will get caught in the middle, with thousands either deliberately released or indeed able to escape. And we will then see the emergence of Daesh 2.0. Mr. Speaker, we must have the strength and the resolve to ask our closest ally to reconsider. Let's also exhibit our own international leadership by energising the same international community that so swiftly came together to defeat Daesh militarily and now needs to stay the course to stabilise the region we helped to liberate. Otherwise, why did we step forward in the first place? Our world is getting more dangerous and the threats more complex. The international community must stick together.
Order. The honourable gentleman speaks with very considerable authority on these matters, and that was part of the rationale for granting him his urgent question. He rather gently pointed out to me that it was his first urgent question, so I granted him some latitude because I think the House wanted to hear from him. But other colleagues can not expect comparable latitude. 2 minutes does not mean 4 minutes. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, nevertheless, the eloquence of my right honourable friend, I think, probably justified the length of time that he took. I'll try to address some of the points that he made. I absolutely agree with him on the point about this being primarily an issue about Daesh, and the concern I would have, to answer his question about foreign fighters and others, is that my worry would be that this will divert SDF from their activities against Daesh in the Euphrates Valley. Absolutely 100%. He will understand that we are talking to all of our interlocutors at the moment. This is very kinetic, it's very fast changing, and of course we need to ensure that so far as we can we influence our partners in a way that he has just described. The US withdrawal, as I understand it, if it happens, will be a fairly small scale. It will involve a small number of troops in the immediate vicinity of the border. That's our understanding. We do not support any incursion by Turkey into north-west Syria. He will know from previous outings at the dispatch box of the extent and breadth and depth of DFID support for the crisis in Syria. We are among the top few in terms of our financial contributions to that awful humanitarian disaster. I hope that begins to address some of the points that he raised.
Thank you. Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question, and let me thank the Right Honourable Member for Bournemouth East, along with all those other members who sought to pursue this issue today, including my friend, the member for Brighton Kemp Town. Mr. Speaker, the number of UQ applications you had today reflects the range of concern and indeed anger across this House about the Trump administration's decision to open the door to a Turkish invasion of northern Syria and the subjugation of the Kurdish people in Rojava, the very people who led the fight against Daesh and 11,000 brave fighters in that process. Donald Trump is not just abandoning those Kurdish allies, he is betraying their sacrifice. And of all the great and unmatched ways in which he has shamed his office over the last 3 years, this is one of the very worst. But simple expressions of anger will not help the Kurdish people now. So let me ask the Minister of State 4 specific questions. First, in answer to critics of his decision, Donald Trump said yesterday, and I quote, that many people agree with it very strongly. And specifically, he said, the UK is very thrilled at this decision. Will the Minister of State make it clear today that that is a lie? And can he explain what, if anything, the Foreign Secretary said yesterday to Mike Pompeo that might have given Donald Trump that impression? Second, will the Minister of State agree to table emergency resolutions at this afternoon's UN Security Council meeting and tomorrow's North Atlantic Council meeting prohibiting Turkey from taking any action on the ground or by air to increase its military incursions into northern Syria, and instead redouble our efforts through those bodies to reach genuine peace settlement and political solution and the negotiated withdrawal of all foreign forces? Third, will he also work through the UN Security Council and the High Commission for Refugees to make clear to Turkey that they must not use the American withdrawal as a green light to forcibly resettle non-Kurdish Syrian refugees in the Rojava region in an effort to change its ethnic composition? And finally, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of State insist, as a matter of urgency, that Kurdish representatives are finally invited to join the Syrian Committee on Constitutional Reform so that they are able to stand up for their own rights? There is an old rule of Middle East conflicts, Mr. Speaker, that one way or another the Kurds will always get sold out. Donald Trump may be following that rule in the most brutal of fashions, but we must unite today, both here and at the United Nations, and say that this time we will not let it happen.
Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions. In terms of the tweet, no idea where that came from. It certainly isn't based upon the conversation that my right honourable friend had with Secretary Pompeo last night. Let me be quite clear. We would be opposed to any incursion by Turkey into Syria. She refers to what is technically called refoulement, that is proscribed under international law. We would most certainly be against any attempt by any state to engage in social engineering, ethnic cleansing or demographic change. She refers to the Constitutional Committee. She'll be aware that Geir Pedersen led on this at UNGA and that this will be stood up on the 30th of September in Geneva. It will be three-pillared, the pillars being the opposition, the regime and independence. And our position would be that all citizens in Syria should be fully represented. There's only one way we can make progress in Syria, and that is through an inclusive political process.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support my right honourable friend's urgent question. This surely is an issue for us to be, in many senses, bolder and more public about our disagreement. As my right honourable friend will know, in the United States, General Petraeus has made it absolutely clear this is the wrong move. The Republicans themselves in Congress are absolutely opposed to this. So this is not an issue about Trump versus just the usual political sources. It is a real problem that we would abandon a key ally in the destruction of the caliphate and only to then release them to the mercies of Turkey. Can we make it very clear publicly, not just to the Americans, Mr. Speaker, that we disapprove of this, but more importantly to the Turks, that if they do carry out their threat, that we would consider this to be an aggressive act against ourselves as much as we would against the Kurds.
Minister of State.
Yes, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Well, I have said in plain terms that we would resist any incursion into Syria. And the reason for that is, well, there are many reasons for it, but one of the principal ones in our minds is that it will divert attention against the principal threat to this country in relation to this conflict, which of course is Daesh. And it would divert, potentially, efforts by SDF from their operations along the Euphrates Valley to the northwest of the country. That would not be helpful. It would destabilise the situation, and I think is probably behind a lot of the concern that has been expressed in Washington. We will continue to work with our allies to push that line, that agenda, because it's right, and if we're going to restore any sort of equanimity in Syria, we need to be united in this particular fight.
Stephen Gethins.
Speaker, can I thank the Right Honourable Member for securing this question and for his comments and those of other colleagues as well. The SDF forces have been critical in the defeat of the murderous death cult Daesh. And one of my concerns, Mr. Speaker, is what does this say about our commitment to allies in the future and on UK foreign policy when we're seeking those boots on the ground? President Trump's policy is ill thought out and what one Pentagon official described as a blatant betrayal. Can he also say what does this mean for UK forces who are still on the ground, and comments on reports that SDF were compelled to demolish defensive fortifications, if he's got any information on that? And finally, what discussions is he having with his Turkish counterparts, in particular on the humanitarian impact? We know from Save the Children that thousands of children and other refugees need access to food and medicines. What is he doing to secure that? And is now the time to repatriate the innocent British children who have been stuck in Syria?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman. The US has to answer for itself. I can't answer for the US or for President Trump. My understanding is that this involves the honourable lady tempts me, but I'm going to resist. The US, I believe, is talking about 50 individuals, 50 US servicemen that they are seeking to redeploy at the moment. That's my understanding. To my knowledge, I have no information on faults. I can't answer his question, I'm afraid. In terms of boots on the ground, again, we need to be careful. The UK does not have regular boots on the ground in Syria. We don't do that. The point about international development and Turkey, he's right to raise this, and he'll be aware that through the FRIT process, FRIT 1, we have been a major donor to this particular crisis, and we're also considering at the moment what our response to FRIT 2 will mean, particularly in the context of our imminent departure from the European Union.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friends and the right honourable lady spoke for the entire House on the important issue raised in this urgent question. But does the Minister understand that Britain must take responsibility for its own nationals and not use some device to evade that responsibility? Nor must we leave them swilling around in ungoverned space where they can do ill in countries less well governed than this one, but where they are also a danger to the people in this country. Does he understand that we may well be talking about approximately 40 people here, of whom maybe as many as 30 are children? Will he raise this matter immediately with the Foreign Secretary and with his colleagues in the government to see if we can get a change of policy and an urgent resolution of that particular issue?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. He's obviously an expert in these matters. There are two categories of individual, aren't there? There are those who are in detention camps, and there are those in Al-Hol, who are the families of detainees in the main. In terms of justice, it's important, in our view, that justice is served as close to as possible to any alleged crime, and we're taking that forward with those in the region. In terms of minors, of course, it is the government's intent that innocents should be protected at all times. He will appreciate the difficulties that poses in the context of Syria, but we are quite clear that minors need to be handled properly and humanely, and that will be our intent.
Anne Clwyd.
Mr. Speaker,
I'm afraid the Kurds are being stabbed in the back once again, as they have so many times in the past. And we do have a responsibility, and we should stand up to it, and we need to know what is going on day by day. We can't wait for the Queen's speech and all of that. We need to know what is happening today and what the Minister will be doing today, because otherwise the Kurds are going to be left to die, as they have so often in the past.
I understand the Right Honourable Lady's frustration. I really do. I think we have to be clear that we can't act alone. We have to act with our partners. That is the reality. The Kurds are not being stabbed in the back by the United Kingdom. US actions obviously are a matter for the US. I hope in my remarks I have given my understanding of the extent and scope of what is in the President's head, so far as I can, and it seems to me that some of the more exaggerated claims probably have been a little bit overdone, but she's right to say this is highly kinetic and things change from moment to moment, and I rather suspect that things do change further. I'm going to be back in this place before too very long, Mr. Speaker.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will be aware, the Minister will be aware that one of the principles of military action is surprise, but it's normally the enemy you're trying to surprise, not your friends. And here we found ourselves surprised by the actions of our most important ally, and our allies on the ground surprised at the possibility they may find their homes under very serious threat from one of our other more important military allies in Turkey. Will the Minister please assure me that our other allies in the region are being assured that the UK will not make a pattern of being fair weather friends, but will actually commit to our allies seriously and properly?
Yes, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. The only point I would make is in terms of surprise. Of course, President Erdogan has threatened this before on a number of occasions, and he has previous in relation to Afrin. So this isn't something that has simply come out of the blue. But I agree with him that we need to ensure that we do everything with our colleagues to understand their thinking in these matters so that we can act in a relatively joined-up way, if that's possible.
Stephen Twigg.
As ever, it's innocent civilians who will suffer the consequences of the humanitarian disaster that will follow this decision. Can I press the Minister to respond to the question from my Right Honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary? It really is time today for us to table this at the United Nations Security Council.
Minister of State.
Well, I can't give the honourable gentleman that commitment here at the dispatch box, but I think the point has been well made and will be considered electively. What he suggests, I'm sure, has merit, but we will have to examine it fully.
Barry Robinson.
Speaker, there have been ongoing concerns regarding the safety and welfare of Syrian refugees on or near the Turkish border. As this progresses and there is a prospect of a safe zone being set up, how can the Minister guarantee that those people will be safe, and also the fears around forcible repatriation or relocation from Turkey into Syria will be challenged? And I'd like to know what representations are being made on their behalf.
Well, she refers to this process of refoulement, which is the forcible repatriation of refugees. We would strongly oppose such a thing, clearly. In answer to the Honourable Lady who speaks for the opposition, I make it very clear. We would oppose anything that looks like ethnic cleansing, demographic change. All of those things are absolutely not appropriate. We will resist it. Now, she'll be aware of the effort we put in through the FRIT process with the European Union, which will endure on our departure, in support of Turkey, which has done a good job, I have to say, in supporting refugees on its territory. And we will continue to support Turkey in doing that. It's got a strong tradition of humanitarian assistance, and it has acted well so far as refugees are concerned up to this point, and we want to encourage it in that process.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As chairman of the APPG for North Eastern Syria, we were in Al-Hol and North Eastern Syria a month ago. I want to disagree with the Minister that I don't think this is just primarily an issue of defeating ISIS. This is also about defending an area that has promoted democracy, gender equality, and has been an ally to us. So will we now suspend security and intelligence information with Turkey so they can't use it against one of our allies? And will we bolster foster support for the SDF to ensure they have the resources they need? And will we also go to NATO to ensure that Turkey can't invoke Clause 5 if there was a backlash?
Hear, hear. Hey.
I don't think we're into Article 5 territory. What I would say is we do support SDF and the coalition. We continue to do that. The principal intent here is the fight against Daesh. Daesh is a clear and present danger. It threatens us all, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that that fight goes on unaffected by this latest news. It's important that we keep our eye on the ball in that respect. There is a lot of work going on, as he may be aware, along the Euphrates River, the Euphrates Valley, against Daesh. It's important that work continues, and this latest news risks destabilising that in our view.
Mr. Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for raising the question. Mr. Speaker, security depends on stability and consistency, and the manner in which the decision taken by President Trump was described does not help that. And it's a reminder, if any is needed, of the dangers of the United Kingdom pivoting too close to United States foreign policy at a time of inconsistency rather than staying close to European allies. Mr. Speaker, could I ask for further reassurance in relation to the global coalition against Daesh, in which the communications cell is based in the United Kingdom, and it does the vital work of dealing with the ideology? Anything that might give Daesh supporters a sense that the United States is weakening in its commitment against Daesh is something that could be used against them and will materially affect those who are carrying on the vital communications work here. Can you assure me that the United States realises that that coalition work is essential and they remain committed to it no matter what this decision may be?
Well, my right honourable friend's point is well made. I can't give him that assurance because I'm not the US, but I'm sure his point will have been heard by our interlocutors. He refers to our allies within the coalition and elsewhere, and he'll be aware that we are working very closely, probably more closely than we have for some considerable time, with in particular our E3 partners, something of a paradox, some might think, given our imminent departure from the European Union, but it remains true nevertheless. And particularly throughout the region which I have geographic responsibility for, I have been struck by the close working relationship that we have in particular with France and Germany.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout this conflict, Syrian civilians have suffered again and again and again. And further to the question that my friend for West Derby asked just now, can I ask the Minister about what we will do? Will we review all of the government's policies at this crucial point and see if we cannot do a little more to accept some more refugees from the region?
Mr. State.
Yeah, I have said in my remarks that alluded to the support that we are giving the humanitarian situation. I suspect probably in a few minutes' time, when I appear before the International Development Select Committee, I shall be quizzed on this further. I'm proud of the contribution made by the British people. I really am. We are in the top few in relation to the support for the humanitarian situation in Syria. I'm also proud that we will, by 2020, have resettled 20,000 Syrians, including in my own constituency. And I think that's a sign of the generosity and big heart of the British people. I think that's a fair contribution, and it's an indication of the UK punching above its weight in international development terms.
It's been blunt.
Having been in North East Syria just 3 weeks ago with the Honourable Gentleman for Brighton Kemptown and my Honourable Friend for Gravesham, can I say to my Honourable Friend the Minister that the justice measures that are being taken forward apparently on the ground will come as, at least 3 weeks ago, it would have been news to the leaders in the region that there was actually any engagement on that issue. But more importantly, I'm sure he understands the scale of Kurdish resentment following the operation against Afrin, which he mentioned, and therefore the scale of Kurdish resistance if there is a Turkish incursion. He has just said we would resist any incursion into Syria and we support the SDF and the coalition. What are we actually going to do to deter Turkey from making this profound mistake of this planned intervention in northeast Syria?
Well, look, Turkey is a major NATO ally. It's a good friend of this country. We have some leverage, I think, with Turkey as a friend and as a partner. He will understand that this is in the diplomatic space at the moment. He is tempting me to make all sorts of contingency preparations, which I'm certainly not going to do at this dispatch box. But clearly this is a dynamic situation, and we have to respond to whatever happens. But our message to Turkey is, please don't do this. It's going to deflect attention from what really matters here, which is firstly defeating Daesh and secondly restoring this poor, benighted country to some sort of equanimity.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Kurdish diaspora has a sizeable presence in Scotland, with a community centre at Dunbryden in my constituency, and I know they would wish me to remind the UK Government of the debt we all owe to the Kurds in relation to the defeat of Daesh. So can he confirm that the United Kingdom Government recognise that they have a moral obligation to help the Kurds and not just to leave them to their fate?
Look, of course, the SDF is part of the coalition against Daesh. I admire our Kurdish friends and partners enormously, and our posture hasn't changed at all. What we're talking about here is the possibility of Turkey moving into northwest Syria. We don't know how far that incursion is going to be, and the fact that the US has said that under those circumstances it would withdraw 50, we understand, of its people from the immediate area. So I think we do need a sense of proportion in respect of this, but of course we have to react to circumstances.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
I'm very sorry to disagree with my friend the Minister, but saying, oh, well, it's only a withdrawal of 50 people is like saying, well, it's only the withdrawal of HMS Endurance before the invasion of the Falkland Islands. Isn't it the fact that if the green light is given to Turkey under its Islamist regime to attack our allies, it will be an act of treachery and betrayal not dissimilar to what happened in 1944 when Stalin basically gave the green light to Hitler to crush the Warsaw Uprising.
Minister of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for that. I disagree with his analogies. We can discuss that, I think, at some depth, perhaps more when we have more time, Mr. Speaker. What I would say is that we've been very clear where we are on this. We would oppose any incursion by our good friend and NATO ally Turkey into Syria. He's tempting me to sort of speculate on what we might do in the event that this happens. I think a lot of his remarks are probably addressed at the US, and no doubt the US, who I'm very sure listened very carefully to my right honourable friend, will have heard his remarks.
Jamie Stone.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable member for Bournemouth East and others have quite rightly spoken about getting international cooperation in terms of persuading President Trump of the error of his ways. We have friends in the United States. We know that General Petraeus, and we know that elements of the Republican Party disapprove of Trump's activities. Could we not use a backdoor approach via our friends, parking our tanks in his backyard, if you like, to get the President to change his mind? With an eye on the next election, this might work.
Minister of State.
Well, I'm not quite sure which election the honourable gentleman is referring to. It certainly would not be the UK government's job to interfere in US elections, presidential or otherwise. He's rightly referred to opposition to this particular thing in Washington, and I'm sure, since no doubt his voice is influential on the Hill, that he will be listened to carefully.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the honourable member for Brighton Kemp Town and the member for Reigate and I were on the ground in Syria 3 weeks ago, the Syrian Democratic Forces were very clear of their appreciation for the help of coalition countries, obviously including the UK and the US. Can the Minister confirm that, given the resurgence of ISIS, particularly around Deir ez-Zor, the fact that at night great swathes of north-east Syria are no-go areas for the SDF after nightfall, but we will redouble our efforts in supporting the Syrian Kurds?
Well, we do support SDF. SDF is an important part of the coalition. Clearly, it's absolutely central to it. And as I said in my earlier remarks, the worry is that this recent news, if it's carried forward, will detract attention from Daesh along the Euphrates River. That would be extremely bad for the stability of Syria, and it would be extremely bad for the rest of us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister rightly says he's proud of DFID's support in the region, and he rightly speaks of the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme. But that's 20,000 people from Syria over the course of 5 years. We only have 1 year's commitment from the government so far about what's going to happen after the end of that scheme next year. And with 12 million displaced people from the Syrian war so far, and the possibility of refoulement and new refugees from this action ahead of us, will he not now consider asking his government to redouble and increase the numbers of people coming to this country for resettlement? Because why should we not want to be the best country in the world for welcoming refugees and allow them to come through safe and legal routes?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. I mean, she says the best. Well, actually, do you know what? I think we probably are. If you look at the sum total of our contribution to this, I think it's extraordinary, actually, and I'm really proud of it. And I'm proud of it on behalf of my constituents and hers, because they're the ones who ultimately provide this. Not the Honourable Lady and not me, it's our constituents. And if she looks at the package objectively, I'm more than happy to sit down and discuss it with her. I think she would share my view that we're doing extremely well in terms of the humanitarian package in Syria, and we will continue to do so.
Seeley. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to declare an interest. I've worked alongside the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, and men and women, I consider them very impressive soldiers and incredibly generous hosts. My question to my honourable friend: if this is just about a redeployment of 50 servicemen, is he saying that this crisis is overblown? Because it seems to me, and I'm not trying to trap him into a trick question, if you have the Turkish army and the Syrian Kurds with their extensive border at each other's throats at any point along that border, it is a potentially extraordinarily state of affairs, both for ISIS soldiers, but also for the stability and the humanitarian aspects of this problem.
Yes, I mean, we're obviously responding to events and what we are being told, but the information that's available to us is that this is envisaged as being relatively modest, but I have to say to the honourable gentleman, whose experience in these matters is broad and deep, that he will know the matter is extremely kinetic, and it may very well change. We have to be consistent, however. We oppose any move into Syrian territory by Turkey. That's the wrong thing to do. And really, I think I'd probably leave it at that. But obviously, this matter is evolving, and we're going to have to respond as we find the situation at the time.
Mike Gapes.
Speaker, the Turkish president has recently improved his relations with Putin, and the Russians and also the Iranians who are fighting on the side of Assad will also have views and interests on what is happening here. Isn't the danger of what President Trump has done is that he actually reduces the influence of other forces in the region and means that the autocrats and demagogues are dominant in this conflict?
Minister of State.
Well, we want to make sure that autocrats and demagogues are not dominant in this conflict. He talks as if action has been taken. That is, to my understanding, not the case yet. So what we're talking about is what might happen. And what we have done is to say that we do not believe that what has been discussed is the right way forward. We believe that we have to ensure that Turkey doesn't go ahead with this. It will be unhelpful. If they don't go ahead with it, then presumably the US will not carry out the action that has been talked about and which the President has been tweeting about.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only way to stand firm against this recent scourge, that is Daesh, ISIS, call it what you will, is to do that, is to stand firm. And to withdraw now, certainly as a former soldier, seems like an act of betrayal to the Kurds, who are brave allies, who I do not want to see on our TV screens fighting for their lives in the days to come. Can the Minister assure me that if there are any British soldiers on the ground, they will not get caught up in the fighting, if indeed there is some, between the Kurds and the Turks?
Yeah, I think I can give that reassurance. As I said in response to an earlier question earlier on, that we don't have boots on the ground. Let me be clear. That means we do not have combat soldiers on the ground, and I'm grateful for the opportunity that he has given me just to clarify that point. We have others as part of the coalition who engage, for example, in training, and across the Middle East we have UK servicemen engaged in the fight against Daesh. That will continue. Our number one imperative is the defeat of Daesh, and I think we have to celebrate the fact that we have been very successful, the coalition against Daesh, in achieving a substantial degradation in that particular malign organisation. That will continue.
For the benefit of those observing our proceedings, I explain that I now call the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, otherwise known as President Moon. Mrs. Madeline Moon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for his statement. It's been very, very clear. But the Minister said that the issue has now moved into diplomatic discussions. It will also be moving this weekend and over the next few days into parliamentary discussions. The NATO Parliament will be meeting here in London, and I can assure the House that parliamentarians across the NATO alliance, and the NATO alliance is not involved in Syria, but allies within the alliance are, will be discussing this, will be talking to the Turkish representatives, will be talking to American representatives who will be at the conference. Across parliaments across the alliance, discussions such as this are taking place, and they are so important to also sending clear, concise messages to the governments who will be making decisions that will impact on all of our countries and our Turkish and our Kurdish communities within them.
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments. Obviously, she serves great distinction as Chairman of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and no doubt these conversations will be had over the next few days, particularly noting Turkey's status within NATO.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've also had the privilege of seeing the work of the Peshmerga combating Daesh on the front line, this time in northern Iraq, and also the work of the Kurds supporting internally displaced people in the region. Can I have an assurance that, in addition to speaking to officials at the top of the US administration, that our interlocutors will be engaging with officials in Ankara to say that any Turkish incursion into northern Syria is unacceptable?
Mr. State.
Yes, of course. I mean, he'll be aware, because he knows how these things work, that these conversations happen all the time. I think there can be no room for confusion in the minds of our Turkish interlocutors where we stand on this. We clearly have something of a privileged position with our good friends, the Turks, given their status as a firm ally of this country and as a member of NATO.
Kate Asamo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of the 50,000 Kurds that live in this country live in my constituency, and they are in a state of absolute anguish about what is about to happen to their families in Rojava. So will the Minister of State agree to meet with Kurdish representatives from my constituency in the next 24 hours so that he can hear